Morning, everybody. My name is Michael Duffy. I'm the chairperson of BAD Sydney, and I'll be interviewing Gary this morning. I'd like to welcome you all here, and I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's their land that we're meeting on today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to thank the City of Sydney that have been very generous. They're our principal partners for this, and also the State Library, of course, without whom none of it would be possible. Just a bit of housekeeping. Please feel free to share this on social media at Bad Crime Sydney or hashtag Bad Crime Sydney. We're, as you can see, abiding by all the COVID restrictions, and we'll go for about 40 minutes and then open you up for questions. I'd also like to welcome the people who are attending on Zoom. There's a vastly larger number of people out there watching us, which is great. There will be the possibility for questions from people watching on Zooms. You can use, I think it's the Q&A function on Zoom if you want to ask questions later on, but you can start feeding questions through at any point that you like. I think that's the housekeeping. We almost didn't hold the festival this year because of COVID, but so many of our audience wanted us to, and we wanted to keep a bit of faith there, and I guess show a bit of faith in Sydney coming back to normal. And fortunately, many of the people who'd appeared here in previous years were prepared to come along again, which is great. Gary has been a good friend of the festival since the beginning, really. He's been here twice before, which is fantastic. And we're particularly delighted to invite him back this time as an author in his own right. He's written this book, which is basically his autobiography, and it's a fabulous book for two reasons. First of all, because Gary himself is so interesting. He's a complex character and not afraid to put that on the line, I think, in the book, which really adds to the interest. You know, it's not just a series of war stories, it's a story of a person going through some extraordinary experiences. And the second thing that I think is really unusually good about it is it's written, I think, in conjunction with a journalist named Dan Box, and we'll talk about this in a minute. But Dan's done a really good job. It's very well written. It's full of insight, you know, and observations and things like that. It's not your normal true crime or, as it were, celebrity autobiography. It's much more than that. So we'll talk about that anyway. But Gary, can you just join me in welcoming Gary Jubelin anyway? Gary was a police officer for 34 years and retired as a detective chief inspector, and I'm not going to go into too many details of his career in a chronological order. Firstly, because I think we're all a bit familiar with that. And secondly, because I'd really like to draw out some of the themes in the book, which I think are really interesting. So if I miss anything, and it's been an action-packed life, I'm sure I will, feel free to ask questions about it later on. But anyway, Gary, tell us a bit about the book. How is it written?
Well, I didn't set out expecting to write a book, certainly when I joined the police a long, long time ago. And after I left the police in the circumstances in which I did, certain people approached me and said, well, perhaps you need to tell your story. And that resonated with me because I wanted to get across what's happened. There was a lot of, surprisingly, I polarise people or people have opinions, and I thought it's important that I told my story, and I felt for the first time I had a story to tell. In regards to who I wrote the book with, it was quite interesting with Dan Box. I'd known Dan for a number of years, and what I liked, he'd been a crime reporter, so our paths had crossed. What I liked about Dan was he was going to call me on my bullshit. Like he wasn't going to let me get away with a soft a book, as you described, Michael, just going through a set of facts. And I wanted to do that, and I wanted to make sure that if you read the book, you understood who I was and where I was coming from, and how things played out the way they did. So it was important that I told the story there. I was surprised how hard it was writing a book. It's not easy, let me tell you. It sounded all very well and good when, yes, what are you doing? Oh, I'm writing a book. That sounded great. But when you actually had to sit down and write, and I've got to shout out to Dan Box, the quality of the way he helped tell the story was something that we set off and we wanted to be both proud of, and it's something that we are proud of. So
that's good. I want to ask a few questions that might seem a bit intrusive, but these are only questions that are raised by that you really lay yourself bare, I think, in parts of the book. And I just want to, explore some of that. The first thing I've got to say is it's an angry book. There's a lot of anger in there. And it's not just recent. I think it runs right through it. Any idea in yourself where that came from or comes from?
Well, I said I wanted the book to be a reflection of me. You can make your own, own decision whether anger carries me through my life. I think to understand, instead of anger, if we say passionate, I'm passionate. I wear my emotions on my sleeve, so to speak. I like to think I do it passion with perspective. But I am driven by anger, but I'd like to think I balance that out. And in the book, and first of all, when the book first came out, the first couple of people that wrote it, quite often the feedback was it's very raw and very honest, and that scared me. I had to check the book and think, what have I put in there? With that was a comment. But my upbringing, I had a hard father that I respected. He's no longer with us, and my mother was the soft side. So there was sort of that yin-yang side of things. So yes, there was anger, but I'd like to think there was compassion that went with the anger. And certainly what drove me in the police, it wasn't just driven by anger, it was driven by what I thought was the right thing to do. And I was fortunate in that the people I worked under, that role models, the ones that I took things away from, and then when I became involved in the victims and the injustices, that sort of drove me. So I've still got the anger, but I'd like to think, compassion and empathy that balances that anger out.
You said that the cops made you an attack dog, and then they turned on you, I suppose, at the end for being that. Do you really need to be an attack dog to be a top-level homicide investigator?
I think it's interesting. I didn't raise that lightly because I know the connotations with that, but I definitely felt that I had a skill set that was built up, and I was unleashed on some tough crimes to do the hard work. Now, there's a lot of ways you can approach an investigation. To be the attack dog, it doesn't mean you're in there in the interview room shouting at someone, but you've got to go hard. And I think if you're going to walk around calling yourself a homicide detective and an inspector running the jobs, you've got to make some hard decisions, and you're going to upset people, and that's the nature of homicide investigation. Let me tell you, when there's no winners, when there's a murder, like you are going to go in and you're going to upset people. Quite often I'd come home from work and think, I would just love a job, maybe a florist or something like that, where you just, it was just a thought, but where you'd come home and you think you're making people happy. But that is not what you do when you're a homicide detective. You are going to upset people's lives, you're going to rattle people, and you're going to be brutal. And I'm not talking physically brutal, but you've got to have a strong sense. It's very hard to get someone convicted of a murder. And to do that, you can't be caught up in self-doubt. So if you're going after something, you've got to go after it and find out what's happened.
And one of the things that comes across in the book very strongly is the incredible toll that it takes on you, and not just you, I'm sure any homicide detective. And one wonders, the various reasons you might do that. You write early on, I want to be the person people turn to when they really need somebody. And that's certainly who you became. But any idea where that one came from?
No, I think I was fortunate that my parents, my upbringing instilled values in me that, you had to be stoic. My father was sort of a hard man, and and I wouldn't say brutal, it was just tough love in the time, but he made me feel that my role was to protect people and to be the strong person. And I think that's where policing became a natural fit for me, especially when the further I got into policing and got into the world of homicide investigations. And I've got these families that are absolutely devastated and then looking for someone to be their strength in the most traumatic circumstances. And it felt like the right fit for me. And you said that it takes a toll. Part of the book, when we first started writing the book, there was an interesting concept that we're looking at, that each investigation takes a little bit out of me and puts a little bit back in. And I think that's a good way of describing homicide investigations. You leave a bit of yourself with that investigation, but in the same regards, it also adds a piece to you. Like I've learnt so much from a personal point of view from people in the greatest facing adversity, or an emotional trauma that most people wouldn't face when a loved one's being killed, and seeing the dignity, the tenacity, the compassion that people have in that. I like to think that I can learn from those people. But I think just perhaps in my nature.
I once talked to a homicide detective called Andy Waterman, who's in your book on a number of occasions, and he said that he got rotated out of homicide at some point, and he said it was probably just as well, that he wouldn't have left voluntarily. But in terms of well-being and so on, it was probably just as well. You were a homicide detective for a lot longer than most people, weren't you? Do you think you did too many homicides? I mean, I'm just talking about the sense of well-being and that sort of stuff.
Well, I suppose that's for other people to judge. Maybe I have done too many homicides, but I found that I had a way of dealing with it. So for 25 years continuously, I was investigating homicides. I was working within different sections within the police, but for 25 years. So you do carry a lot, but each year or day, well, my thought was that when I left the police, every day I came to work, I was learning something new. So I was building a skill set to investigate homicides, but also a way of dealing with it, knowing that I could give it 100%, and I'd bring it home sometimes, but I had a quick bounce back. Sometimes I felt like, yeah, this is just too much, but it'd only take me a day or two and I'd recover and sort of bounce back. So I think it's within in your makeup and the people around you that support you. Looking back at my career, I know that I would have been a pain in the ass for family, friends and all that. And writing the book, I felt like I had to ring up all these people and apologise as I'm reflecting on my life. I haven't finished all the calls, so don't worry, there's still a few other people that waiting for the calls. But by the support that I had by family and friends and that they let me do my thing, that was why I could go so hard as I did with homicide, because you feel like you're being drawn to the victims and your cases, but you're also being drawn to your family and friends. And it was through the generosity of my family and friends that allowed me to put the effort into my work.
There's a terrible tension in there, isn't there, often, where you obviously want to spend time with your family or friends or loved ones, but you're drawn back to the job, and you talk about this yourself with many people on many occasions. And sometimes I thought, this is a story of a workaholic, but then in other times you think, well, hang on, this is serious stuff. It's homicide. And I think at one point you even refer to the work as almost sacred. I mean, do you think that is, in that way, homicide almost a sort of higher calling or a bit different to the other sorts of things people can do?
Yeah, in terms of higher calling, the way I describe homicide, and I'm very strong on this, and people within the police might say, load of crap. This is what I think in homicide. If you're not prepared to bleed for the job, you're not prepared to make the sacrifices, there's plenty of other areas you can work within the New South Wales Police, not homicide. So if you're going to walk around calling yourself a homicide detective, be prepared to pay the price. And I say that in very strong terms, that you're investigating someone's death. You can't do it as a 9-to-5 job. You've got to fully commit. And if you can't fully commit, you're not there as a conscript. You have options to leave. There's plenty of people that will take your place, and it might be a case that do it for a couple of years, burn out, and then move on, recharge. Not judging people on that, but I just don't think homicide investigation is a place where people shouldn't be giving it 100%. It's too serious. You're not mucking around. People have died, and you're the person responsible for finding out who killed that person.
I think a big change or a dividing line in your life, at least from reading the book, was that the show Underbelly Badness that many of you may have seen. I think it was 7 or 8 years ago. I think it basically made Gary the best known serving detective in Australia, probably. It was all based on Strike Force Tuno, which was an extraordinary long-running investigation, which was hugely successful, led to the imprisonment of the Perish brothers and other people. Lots of convictions for murder and a whole raft of other crimes. So it was all very warranted, but you acquired this fame, and I'm just interested in what that did to you. And in particular, it kind of gave you a standing or an authority, I guess, within the hierarchy of the New South Wales Police Force. Almost made you slightly independent, didn't it? Because you had a public profile now that was often higher than the police commissioner. So how did that change your life, having that fame?
It was a double-edged sword, and it's not something that I regret. I knew what I was getting myself into when they approached the senior police, and it was agreed to that they do this story. And I'm proud of the work that we did on that, and it was a team effort, the strike force. But in any drama thing, they've got to focus on get someone to focus the character on. Having your private life played out very publicly on a show, and it was a top-rating show at the time, Underbelly, it was quite confronting. It was also flattering, and I'm not going to sit here and go, oh, no. And I've heard other people say, oh, I wouldn't like that. And I don't think they're being entirely honest. I think anyone would like the recognition for doing the work. Did make me a target. I felt that it was a useful tool that I could use in that it gave me a little bit more clout. And I'd like to think I used it in a positive way, not just it fed an ego. It was something that it could make a difference. I noticed even in the witness box at court that the defence barristers would go after me harder because it was almost like, let's beat up the bloke from Underbelly. There was, I think, some tension within senior police at the profile I had, and it made it harder for them to manage me. I'm not saying I'd be the easiest person in the world to manage, but my intent was always for the right reason. But I think it probably played a part, because I did notice a shift from there. And when you do get a profile, good or bad, people start to, I heard things that I supposedly did, and it was just rumours, and it was hard to cut through that. But I've got no regrets from it. I knew what I was getting into, and I'd like to think that type of thing might inspire other police to go hard on investigations.
Yeah, no, it was an extraordinary time. There's a great story in your book about you went out for a drink with the actor who portrayed you, and someone came up and recognised him and not you. But I don't think that would happen anymore.
That was quite funny, because the bloke came up, and I'll tell the story because it is. Matt Nable who's a friend of mine now who played me in the Underbelly. We were out having a drink, and someone came up all excited to meet Matt Nable because he played Gary Jubelin on the Underbelly thing. And I sat there for 5 minutes. Matt was playing it up, and I'm thinking, well, hold it, I am the actual Gary Jubelin. Then the poor bloke, or I won't say poor, he thought it was a great night. Then Matt said, well, actually, this is Gary Jubelin. And he looked around, and we made his day. So that was quite funny.
You certainly used that, your high profile with Bowraville, didn't you? I mean, you really ran a campaign there almost. I don't mean in an official way, but you actually say in the book, you were doing it for all the right reasons, you thought, and you really, I mean, I can't think of anything like that in my lifetime where a serving police officer has, in some cases, by disobeying, his boss, has gone out and done things like that. In retrospect, do you think that the fame encouraged you to go a bit too far, or any regrets there?
Who could have seen that ending in tears? Coming to this building actually reminds me that I marched down Macquarie Street on 3 occasions with the families, Bowraville, blocking off the street in the protest out the front of Parliament House. I've got no regrets whatsoever. Whether it helped with my career, I suggest not. I remember at one stage I was marching with the families down Macquarie Street, and I got a call from the police media unit, and they said that we've got information of police officers marching with the protesters. And I said, that's me. Do you want me to? Yeah. So I don't think it endeared myself. But look, I do say it unashamedly, that I did push with the Bowraville matter, because that was a total injustice, what happened to the 3 families there and the community. 3 Aboriginal kids murdered, and the response at the time was not appropriate, and investigative opportunities were missed. And this is just not my opinion. Mr. Scipione came up to Bowraville and actually said to the families that we could have done better. And I think that was very powerful and very positive, that we've learnt lessons from that. But there was an injustice there, and the sad part with the Bowraville thing, unless there was an active campaign in the media or we blocked off Macquarie Street, no one cared and no one listened. So I've got no qualms about that. And I think personally, and others might have other opinions, I think that's using what recognition I had for a good cause.
Can I just pause for a moment just to say, anyone who's watching this on Zoom, please feel free to start sending through some questions if you want to, using the Q&A function. Gary, I'm interested in the subject of resourcing. It sounds a bit boring, but some of the arguments you had with your bosses, which were probably pretty important, were over resourcing for investigations where they thought the resources should go somewhere else. They had limited resources, they had to allocate them as they saw fit, and you obviously disagreed with them. How are people supposed, that this happens in every line of work, of course, we have arguments over resources. You're sure that you were right and they were wrong. And that's, I asked a couple of people I know who've read this book, the one question they wanted me to ask you, and that is, how do you know you're right all the time? But in this particular case, resourcing for specific investigations, what arguments can you put to say that you deserve those resources more than your colleagues sitting at the desk down the corridor?
Okay. First of all, I'm not right all the time, and I can acknowledge that. But my responsibility, whether that was at senior constable level, sergeant level, or inspector level when I left, and particularly you're at sergeant and inspector level, where you're actually running the homicide investigations. I'm responsible for that homicide investigation. I'm going to argue for resources. Now, the person sitting at the desk beside me might have a homicide investigator, another homicide investigation. They can argue for those resources as well. I respect and accept the bosses, and when I talk the bosses, the people that would sit above me to determine the allocation of resources, I accept the decision, but they're going to have to be able to justify that decision. And I had, I think it was with the Tuno job, the difference in organised crime murders and the murder I did before that particular one, I think it was a child murder where it was very contained. But I had the same amount of resources on that as I did for the organised crime murder. So, look, I said at the start of this talk, I might have been a pain to manage, but I didn't say I don't think I'm right. I just think I'll put my case, they can put their case, and we accept the umpire's decision. If it's outrageously wrong, I will come back again. I'm fairly tenacious at that. And I might have alienated people because I'm prepared to back up what I'm arguing about and show the facts and figures. It's not just me, being aggressive, saying I want more resources. I'd like to think I justify it, but I do acknowledge that it's difficult allocating resources because everyone's murder is just as important. But I think it's the officer in charge's role and responsibility to argue for those resources.
Let's talk about victims for a moment. You're famous and respected for the way you've dealt with victims on a number of cases. Across the system, as it were, the justice system, the police system, what should we be doing better to deal with victims right now?
The thing that I think sets my career apart with the victims and the acknowledgement or the feedback, the positive feedback I get from victims, that I made myself available to them. And that's something that certain police mightn't choose to do. It was just a personal thing on mine. I'd turn up at a murder scene and I would say that, here's my number, you contact me anytime. Much to my regret, they would contact me anytime, and it's nothing to get midnight calls, literally. And it might be the victims going at me, abusing me. It might be they wanted comfort, whatever they needed, I was there for them. And that's something that I thought was important. And that type of way that I dealt with victims, that to me seemed to be the thing that really resonated with them, and they could realise that I was in for this. I never promised to a victim, and this is a homicide thing, and I never promised to a victim that I would solve the murder, but I did promise I would do everything humanly possible to get a result for them. So I think giving to the victims, because I say to young police, or I said to young police, I'm not talking to them now, but the message that I had was treat the families the way you would want your family treated. And I think if anyone's got the empathy to put themselves in that position on how they would want the police to react if their loved one was murdered, I think you've got the template for how victims should be treated. The Bowraville one, and with the Bowraville investigations, that was the three Aboriginal children, Colleen, Clinton and Evelyn, murdered in 1990-91. 3 kids living in the same street, murdered over a 6-month period. I came in 5 years after those murders as a reinvestigation, and the thing that the families felt that no one cared, and the difference, and I've been working on it for 25 years, not just myself, also Jerry Bowden, Bianca Cominar and Jason Evers before them. And we made ourselves available to the victims, and that meant so so much. So if the police can do anything, and I think they're onto it, they've got it in writing, it's just putting it in practice. Be there for the victims. The victims don't want just counselling. Like, that's not your role as a police officer, but your police officer is there to do what you can do for the families. And I think if you carry that through, and that magic word empathy, if you've got genuine empathy for the victims get a sense that that's the case.
Yeah, Dan Box, by the way, has written a very good book about the Bowraville cases too, which is well worth a read. It's still extraordinary to read the history of Bowraville and just see where it's ended up. Do police have the resources or the powers that they need, in your opinion, looking back over your career? And I'm thinking particularly about the right to silence that criminals have, but there may be other things you want to talk about.
Look, the right to silence, I do understand it now because of my circumstances. I'm looking at the criminal justice system from both sides, and it's changed my view on a few things. And I'll just talk personally on that with the charges that came against me, how intimidating and oppressive it is to feel like the full weight of the state coming after you. And my charges were very minor, but I also understood the system, but I felt how intimidating that was. So we do need those checks and balances in the justice system. So I'm not saying eliminate the right to silence, but I think courts have got to evolve. And the part of the Bowraville thing was the double jeopardy legislation. Those that don't understand that, if someone had been acquitted of a crime, they could never be recharged with it. But the Bowraville campaign overturned that. I think we do need to make adjustments. We need to come to terms with life as we know it now. In terms of resourcing for police, and I talk of this now, I'm 2 years out of policing, or almost 2 years, but I've still got a sense of what it is. What I've noticed the difference with a homicide investigation from 25 years ago to an investigation currently is 25 years ago, these were the type of things that we'd have to follow up. We'd check the home phone line. Was there any calls to or from, or a business phone line? That was about all the data that we could collect. Now look at the mobile phone. There's not one person in this room with a mobile phone. If we put our mind to it, we couldn't track your movements throughout the day. So if someone gets murdered, the amount of work that's required, CCTV footage, looking at all the available data, I don't think we've caught up on that. And my pet thing when I was at homicide was we need more analysts. The work that analysts do now with all the data, because if we haven't got the analysts, the detectives are doing that work. So I think we need to resource that. And as a general comment on policing, focus on what's important to the public. And what is important to the public is that they can relate to the police, and the police, they feel safe in the community. And I think if the police aim for that, that's where we should be headed.
Yeah, there was something in the William Tyrrell investigation you talk about a few times where the hours of phone intercepts you had that you hadn't had the chance to listen to were just piling up into the thousands. Absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, and on the William Tyrrell matter, and I said it at my court matter, at my criminal matter, so we're not talking out of school, it's public record, but for people that we're looking at where we had lawful listening devices in there, thousands of hours. And you think, how does that happen? But you've got to understand that to clear thousands of hours of listening device, you've got to have someone physically there listening to that the whole way through. So it does take a lot of time. And yeah, resources are, they're not unlimited. I get that. But yeah, some of the things that police are confronted with now, I'm not sure that senior police are really au fait with the world that we operate in now and the pressures. I personally think policing is a lot tougher job now than what it was when I first started out. If I made a mistake in policing in my early days, the sergeant would pull me aside and say, that's not how it's done. Nowadays, young police make a mistake and it's on YouTube or the front page, and there's a lot of pressure on them, and there's a lot of things that it's very difficult for them to be thrown into that world.
It must be. There's actually an article, and I think it's the Sun Herald this morning, I think on the front page, about complaints within the police force, often of police complaining about police. Just talking about your own court matter recently, the magistrate said you acted above and beyond legality. You quote that in the book, and that finding was confirmed by an appeal court. What are your thoughts on that now? How do you feel about what you went through?
I think what I went through was disgraceful. I don't think I needed to go through that. I do respect the courts, and it'd be hypocritical of me to sit here after 34 years of policeman and say I don't respect the courts. Breaking it down, the charges that I was charged with was recording a conversation with a person I was speaking to about the disappearance of William Tyrrell. I maintained that I was recording those conversations to protect my lawful interests. I've got to accept now it's gone to the local court and the magistrate. It's gone to appeal, and they've ruled against me. It would be probably more beneficial for me to sit here and say, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done it, but I maintained from the outset why I recorded those conversations. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't to further the investigation into William Tyrrell's disappearance. I was working to further the investigation, but the purpose of me recording those conversations was protect my lawful interests, should allegations be made against me. I was going in to speak to a person on my own, which is unusual in a murder investigation to speak to someone on your own. But that strategy was put in place in consultation with a senior forensic psychologist, where we sat down and we thought this person would have best rapport if he spoke to me one-on-one, as in he identifies with me as being the leader of the investigation, or leading the investigation, and that's how we get a rapport. That left me particularly vulnerable. Also, what came out in the court matter was that the listening devices regularly broke down. That evidence was all available. Now, the magistrate, smarter in legal terms than I am, so is the district court judge. I've got to accept that they've ruled against me. I'm just offering my opinion on that's why I recorded the conversations. I'm not ashamed of recording the conversations. If I had my time over again, would I? And that's a difficult question to consider, because if I had my choice, I'd still be a homicide detective. There was a lot of investigations I hadn't seen through that I wanted to see through, so I'd still like to be a homicide detective. But given the information available to me at the time, I probably would record those conversations. But yeah, I'd be stupid given what's happened to say, would you do it again? I'd probably say no. But it's such a difficult one, and I'm just surprised it was handled the way it was handled. It did not have to be handled this way. The way information was released to the public, I thought was disgraceful, and there was no investigation carried out about that. I was taken off investigations and wasn't allowed to do a handover. Again, I didn't see that as necessary. So I've moved on from it. It doesn't actually look like when I'm sitting here talking like this. See, I've just moved on from it. Yeah. How do I get out of this one? I'm not sure. I have moved on from it. I could have sulked and be cranky. I'm talking about it raised, and it still invokes an emotion in me. It frustrates me, but I accept it and I moved on from it, and I'm looking forward to what I can do outside the police. So.
And the question raised by the last lines of your book: will you pay the fine?
Okay, let me set the record straight with the pay the fine.
It's in your book.
Yeah, I know. Make one little quote. I think the quote was, I'd rather go to jail than pay the fine, which I still maintain. And people go, you're kidding, because I wouldn't be too popular in jail, and I accept that. But I just felt that, I don't know, something in me just did not feel right being financially punished for doing police work, because that's what I was doing. No one suggested I was doing anything other than police work. There was no suggestion I was doing it for my own gain or benefit. So to pay a fine, I'm thinking, if I'm that bad, you should send me to jail, not fine me. Now, having said that, and I did say it, and it's in the book, so I can't deny it, I must admit I got up one weekend after appearance at court. I think it was at the appeal court, and that was on a Friday. On the Saturday, and there was a picture of myself on the front page of the Telegraph saying I'd rather go to jail than pay the fine. I thought, not a good look. But anyway, it is what it is. It's an opinion, and it's not me being arrogant. It's just saying how I genuinely felt that I was doing police work, and I felt uncomfortable that I was going to be fined for doing police work.
Sorry, just to pause. There's someone wanting to come in there. Would one of our volunteers mind just assisting them? Thanks. A general question, but what's it like being out of the police, given the intensity of your dedication for those many years? And you've got a line in the book, everyone who leaves the cops regrets it.
Okay, a couple of things about being out of the police. Less pressure. For as long as I can remember, every 6 weeks I was on call. So that meant basically you sat by your phone and you waited for a phone call at any time of the day, and you could be sent anywhere in the state, and you mightn't get back for a month or so. So I don't miss that, and I didn't realise how intense that part of it was. In terms of where my life is now, outside the police, I've still got the passion for what I was doing in the police, and now I'm trying to use that passion in the work that I'm doing as a journalist, and trying to focus on helping the victims. The victims still contact me. My comment in the book about anyone that leaves the police regrets it. I've seen that throughout my career, where people that have hit a wall within policing have left it, and then I see them a couple of years down the track and they go, oh, maybe it wasn't that bad, maybe I should have. It's a very rewarding career. I'd recommend it to anyone. But in saying that, life outside the police, when you do get out of that bubble, you realise how small that bubble actually is within the police. Everything that you think is important, when you step out of that little world, that you realise there is a big world out there. So also what's happened to me, and people have said this to me, and I've got to take stock on this. People have said it's probably the best thing that happened to me, me coming unstuck the way I did, or leaving in the controversial circumstances, because I think by my nature I would have just stayed in there and probably died on the job. And I've left at a time when I've still got energy to do things outside policing, so the timing was probably right.
Well, let's talk about those. I've been enjoying Gary's podcast. I'm sure many of you have listened to it too. It's been hugely successful. I Catch Killers, in which he interviews a lot of police or ex-police, plus the occasional crook, and it's just gripping stuff. But Gary, what's it like becoming a journalist? I mean, how have you found that?
Pretty scary, actually. A funny thing about journalism, and because I'm working in the Sunday Telegraph in the offices there, and listening to the type of decisions that have been made, and I thought that policing was hard. But what I found with policing, it's very black and white in the decisions that you make. In that, if I'm pushing on something, I'm trying to catch a killer. So that's what was driving me. There's a lot of ethical and moral decisions that have got to be made within the media, and utmost respect for the decisions that are made there. It's also, I remember the first article I wrote for the Sunday Telegraph, and it's like writing a uni assignment and then sending it out to the whole state. And I've never been so nervous in my whole life. And I sent the draft to Claire Harvey by email, and she responded back and just said, thanks, got it. And I thought, oh, that's really positive, isn't it? And when I got into the office, I hadn't realised, she actually sent me another email and said, oh, you can actually write as well. So that made me feel a little bit better. But it's a new world, and it's a world that I've come in, and I'm always about paying your dues. And I know that because of my circumstances, I've come in at a level that I really should be serving an apprenticeship. But I've met some interesting people in the media, and they're guiding me. With the podcasts, I got signed to do podcasts, and we weren't even really sure of the form of it. And I know a lot of people like the sort of listening to the two cops sitting down talking in a pub, with a fly on the wall, like talking shop. And that's what we've tried to create with the podcast series. So having a bit of fun with it. I think I'm improving it each time and upskilling a bit. But it wasn't easy going from being a policeman straight into journalism. But in saying that, there are skills that's transferable.
No, that's good. I think you've skipped a few grades in the journalist ladder, but that's okay. I think you're doing well. Second last question. What next professionally? I understand something's happening with 60 Minutes.
Yeah, I've signed to do some work with 60 Minutes, and also continue on with my the podcast series. So I'm very mindful of the stuff that I want to do. I've been fortunate in the situation I've been, that there's been a lot of offers put forward to me, and I'm looking at trying to do something that I feel good about. Like I talked about when Dan and I were discussing the book, we want to do something that we're proud of, and something that it will stand up to scrutiny. with the work in the media and the work with 60 Minutes, that's what I want to do as well. I want to make sure that I'm doing something that's meaningful and I'm doing something that I'm proud of. And yeah, I know that there's a lot of work or stuff that I've got to do. And actually, the past 18 months have been some of the busiest times in my life because I know that I'm starting in this new field. And as I said, it's about learning your trade and paying your dues. So I've been particularly busy, but I am looking forward to, some exciting projects coming up.
Okay, that's good. I'm going to open it up for questions now. We've got about 15, 20 minutes. Anyone on Zoom, please send them in using the Q&A function. And I think we may already have a few questions. Now, it's a bit laborious when we ask a question. I'm going to have to repeat it because we're not handing a microphone around because of COVID. So if you wouldn't mind just being a little patient there, that would be good. We might start with a COVID one. This is from Louise. Is there one case in your career that still lingers more strongly than others, and why?
As I said before, every case has an impact on you. And when you're talking homicide and the amount of homicides I've done, I'm always mindful that I don't put one above the other because each one is so important. The one that lingers that I probably think about more than any is, and I'd say in part due to the circumstances that I was taken off the investigation, is the William Tyrrell matter. That's a 3-year-old child abducted from a street in a small country town, dead-end street. We need to solve that, and solving it's just not acceptable. I ran that investigation for 4 years, and I gave it my all, as did a lot of people on the investigation. But to walk away in the circumstances I've had to with that, with no handover provided to the investigators. And look, I don't think there's a police officer in New South Wales that doesn't want it solved. I just hope they put in the effort. And as I said, sometimes you've got to bleed for a job. And by that, I mean really roll your sleeves up and go hard on it. That frustrates me. Of course, the Bowraville matters, 25 years I've been working on that investigation. They haven't got justice in the form of a person convicted, but we have made such significant steps along the way. I feel proud about that. There's other investigations that I still, have thoughts that could be solved that I'd like to see that continued on. So, yeah.
It's interesting. There's a very moving quote in the book from one of the Bowraville family members. I think she said something like, justice comes in different ways or something like that. And I mean, you certainly haven't reached the end of that road, but you've gone a way down it, which is good.
Just on that quote, that was from Auntie Elaine Walker, that she was an elder and she's sadly passed away. But the first time I met Auntie Elaine was, I think, 96, 97. And she abused me. She said, "You are a white cop. You come onto my land and you're telling me blah, blah, blah." And that was the nice part of what she said to me. She scared me. But following on from that, we developed a relationship, and she took me under her wing, and she'd walk past and go, "You've got a lot to learn, white fella," and stuff like that. It got to the point where I was receiving phone calls from her at least once a week, and we became very, very close. And probably the proudest, or one of the proudest moments in policing that I had was at her funeral, and her family invited me along, obviously. And when the coffin was being buried, they asked if I could help bury a coffin with the family. So, when you're talking about little things that you pick up from policing, you can't buy that. And
a question from in the room. Is there one from down the back there, or question? Yes, please.
Congratulations, brilliant book. It should be on everyone's Christmas card, Christmas list for I'm sure. Lots of people would love it. It resonated with me with Michael Connolly. I just think it's brilliant. Are we to hope for another book from you in the future? I mean, could this be, something we look forward to?
So the question there was, can we look forward to more books? Someone said that Gary's memoirs have something of the gripping quality of a Michael Connolly novel. And in fact, I've actually got another question here from Zoom from Kelly saying, have you thought about writing crime fiction using your knowledge? I'll just throw those both together. Any comments on future books?
Well, first of all, thank you for the positive feedback on the book, and that honestly, it means a lot. There has been discussions about a second book, nothing that we've locked in on, and it's something that I would have to be passionate about writing. I've also had people mention about a fictional thing based on their experiences. I'm looking at all that. I've got a lot on my plate at the moment, what I'm concentrating on, but yeah, it's certainly something to consider. I think that what we hoped we achieved, and when I say we, it was Dan Box and I, it was a joint project, was give people a bit of an understanding into the world of what it's like to be a detective and the price that you pay, the funny moments, the sad moments, the scary moments. It's all in there. So yeah, thank you.
Here's a question from Tanya on Zoom. It's an interesting one. She says, it's not always easy for officers to speak out when they see fellow officers doing the wrong thing. What advice would you give to officers still in the job when they see senior officers engaged in misconduct or behaving unjustly?
That's an interesting question. I can't get myself into trouble with this one, can I? I think the best way, and I'm going to skirt around that question a little bit, but you've got to hold your moral compass in any environment. Now, the world's not perfect. If you've seen something as a police officer that is absolutely, there's a no-brainer, you need to report it. You need to stand strong and pay the price for standing strong, because there's a cultural, like any organisation, there's a culture, and it goes right back to the Australian culture. No one likes a dobber, that type of thing. But I went through my career, and I was working in major crime before the Royal Commission. I was working in major crime after the Royal Commission, and I've seen a lot. And the way that I think I had a positive influence on it was holding my own moral compass. So if someone did something that was out of line, I'd take that person to task and I'd deal with it straight away. But it's a difficult, in such a broad way of answering it. So the only advice I could give to young police, and I encourage people to join it, but hold your moral compass. If you hold your moral compass, because what happened with the Royal Commission, little things, the things that were uncovered during the New South Wales Police Royal Commission, it's where one rule's broken and then it just became a slippery slope. And so that's what I'm talking about, holding your moral compass on making sure that you do things that you're comfortable with that are ethically correct.
Okay, another question from in the room, please. Yep.
You worked hard on an investigation, and notwithstanding all of your efforts, you still didn't get a conviction. How did that make you feel?
So the question is that Gary worked hard on an investigation and didn't get a conviction despite all his efforts. How does that make you feel?
On a personal point of view, it frustrates, but I wouldn't accept it if I didn't do everything I possibly could. So if I know that I've done everything that I possibly could, and when I say major crime's a team sport, so we as a team have done everything that we can, and we fail. Yes, I'll be frustrated. I might be angry, and and especially if I perceive there's been an injustice or a misjustice within the courts, or certain things weren't presented. But I think it's important as a police officer, and that's where you would come unstuck if you took it all to the point that you held on to everything. I walk away from courts, and I've walked through from the Supreme Court here, sometimes kicking stones through the park, and very frustrated. But it makes me more determined to go harder the next time. And if I think that it's because of my mistakes that something hasn't been solved, I would take it very hard. But I can deal with it if it's the person's acquitted. If I've taken it, if it's got to the charge point and gone to trial, if I've done everything possible. But I'm not a good loser. I do take it personally, but that's the way I deal with it.
Thanks. Would you like to ask a question there? Yep. So the question is, if Gary was the Chief of Police, what are the 3 things he would change right now?
I would, and again, you're asking me a question that I'm answering from a personal point of view. But I think what saddens me with the police at the moment is that the focus is on what you can get from the police. I think police, we're public servants, and we should learn from the fact that public servants, it's a pretty interesting term, isn't it? Public servant. You're there to serve the public. We should be serving the public, so we should be meeting their needs. I think there needs to be focus on police powers. I think senior police need to back up junior police if they make mistakes. It's inconceivable to think someone could come into such a complex area as policing without learning by making mistakes. But those mistakes don't have to be attacked. There should be lessons learnt. I would also like, and my frustration within the police, and it's hard to articulate it if you haven't been within the organisation, but we had focuses on, you've got to make sure diaries are checked, this has got to be checked, and that's got to be checked. The public couldn't care less whether the car diary added up correctly. But what they do want to know is that the police are there to respond immediately if something happens, and they want to know that, you know, everything that can be done if a crime has happened, and the detectives will come in and investigate it. I think the focus, what I saw within the police, was the focus was off doing what our core business was, and that was policing the community. And that's not just locking people up, it's keeping the community safe. But the focus and what people get rewarded for within the police has nothing to do with what the core values of policing should be, and that should be protecting the public and chasing down offenders if they've committed crimes. And I think, yeah, we've lost our way in that regards.
A question from Julie on Zoom. What's the best piece of advice you could give younger people wanting to have a career as a homicide detective?
Go for it. It's a great career. I've loved it. It was rewarding. I think that understand that you're going to have to pay a price. As I said, if you're not prepared to pay a price, that's probably not the area for you. It is some of the most rewarding work I've done as a police officer. I would encourage them to do it. It's not, I have seen people come into homicide that want the exciting car chases and the arrests and all that. A lot of homicide investigation is a long, hard slog, and you've got to be prepared to take the hard jobs with the good jobs. So, but I think it's a fascinating area, and I would, if anyone joined the police, and I respect the work that general duties police do, highway patrol, the lot of them, but if you've got a passion for investigation and you really want to do something that you can throw yourself in 100%, homicide investigation is the way to go.
Question from the room there, Doc. So the question is, Gary dealt with a lot of trauma in his life professionally. He dealt with it well, but there was an awful lot of it. How did you cope with that or deal with that on your days off?
Sometimes it became, it did wear you down. And there was only a couple of moments when I really felt the dark clouds come over, and that was in the middle of investigations or hadn't had much sleep. And I think I just don't want to deal with this evil anymore. Like, it's just, okay, I'll get up and I'll come to work and face the horror that you're going to face at work. I personally dealt with it. I think I was just fortunate that I had a good bounce back. I kept myself fit. That was something that helped me, I think, along the time. So if I'm really smashed by work, I'd go boxing or whatever and then get smashed in the ring, and then you forget about your work because someone's hitting you in the face or kicking you. So that was a way. I also did, and it was ridiculed when I first started, but I think it's becoming more acceptable, meditation. And a thing that I was into was, or still into, is something called Qigong, which is like Tai Chi and yoga and all that. So I've been doing that for a long time, and that was my sort of go-to place when I came home and full of anger. And I'd go, okay, I'd sit down and meditate, and then I'd come out and almost be half human after that. I also surrounded myself with family and old friends that don't get caught up in your world, and they can call you for who you are, and just staying in touch with reality, because I think we get caught up in the policing and the intensity of policing, and it's good to step away from that sometime and get your release outside of that. And also I do like a drink. every now and then.
Thank you.
I was actually out with that person last night having a drink, so I had to add that.
All right, no further comment. We've got a Zoom question here we probably won't be answering. Who killed William Tyrrell? But we have time for one more question from the room. Is there anyone who'd like to ask our last question? Yep, thank you.
In the case of Matthew Levison and the result that came out of that too, like I guess as a parent, you get the body or you get the killer. How, obviously you've exhausted all avenues to get a conviction. How do you get that and make it okay?
Look, it was...
Sorry, can I just say this is a question about the Matthew Levison case, which was very unusual. We'll get Gary to explain it, but the question is, how did he reach this very unusual outcome?
Yeah, the Matthew Levison, those that don't understand it, it was a young man that was disappeared. And for 10 years, his family, Mark and Faye Levison, tried to find out what happened to him. Matt's boyfriend at the time had been charged with murder, but was acquitted of Matt's murder, and the family still didn't have answers. I became involved in that investigation as a re-investigation, and narrowing it down, it's a long story, but it got to the point where I said to the Mark and Faye, Matt's parents, what do you want to achieve here? Because we pushed for an inquest. I said, I'm going to pick a fight. We're going to get an inquest, even though the person had been acquitted. And that hadn't been done before, but I thought it was worthwhile giving it a try. I said to Mark and Faye, what do you want? What's the things that you want from this? And they said, we want justice against the person who's done this to Matt, and we want to get Matt's body back. And they used to go in the national park just to understand the pain that these people are going through, searching for Matt's remains on their weekends, going in with a pick and shovel, just randomly searching around national park looking for Matt's remains. So that's the sort of pain they carried. They said to me, we want Matt's body back. And I said, okay, well, I've got an idea. It hasn't been tried before, but we'll try it. And just keeping it simple, we put Michael Atkins in the witness box, and the coroner agreed to give him a Section 61 certificate, which allowed him in the witness box to make any admissions he wanted, and we couldn't use it against him. So in effect, he could get in the witness box and say, I killed Matt, and this is how I did it, but there's nothing you could do about it. Sounds strange. It was a high-risk thing, but it was about doing the thing that was right for Mark and Faye. The end result was that we got Matt's body back, and I had the, and I won't say pleasure, but the emotional experience of standing with Mark and Faye for 5 weeks or 4 weeks while we're digging up national parks with machines looking for their son's remains. And then the moment where a colleague called me over, and it was down to the last hour of the search, and we found Matt's remains, and I still get chills down my spine thinking about that. But I caught up with Mark and Faye as recently as last Saturday, and it was the right thing to do. It's helped them deal with their situation, and they could bury Matt, so it was worth it. But that is what I talk about, pushing the envelope in homicide investigations, sometimes thinking outside the square, and that's a good example of it.
And just to be clear, there was no admission to murder in that case, was there? No.
That's 100% correct.
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
Look, we're almost finished. I just got one last question. I'm going to cheat and allow it through because it's such a good question, and the answer will probably be quite brief. This is from Claire on Zoom. Gary, you are a hero to many in the community. Who's your hero?
The people that I find inspiration from, and what has driven me, is the people and the homicide victims, the families, their tenacity that they keep up, get up and keep going each day. And I look at those people, they're my heroes, because I don't know how I would cope in that situation, whether I'd have the tenacity or strength or courage to continue fighting for justice. So they're the people I look up to.
Okay, thanks very much. We're done here. Books will be on sale and Gary will sign them at the bookshop over in the other part of the library. And for people on Zoom, you're welcome to Google the State Library of New South Wales bookshop, and they will sell you a book without postage, which is very decent of them. Gary, thank you very much for being here. Can I ask you all to thank Gary Jubelin?